Welcome to our September garden. As you can tell from this dying squash and the browning corn behind me, our season is coming to an end. It's at this time of year that we're bringing in some of our largest harvests and preparing to store this food over the winter. But it's also a time when we can glean valuable information from our garden because the records that we've kept so diligently all summer long can now be used to answer questions. Did changes to crop spacing impact the total yield? Or did moving a crop from one location to another influence the performance? There are so many answers available to us right now if we're paying attention. In my September plot tours that I did for my Seed to Table course students, I took some time to highlight 14 specific lessons that I picked up from our gardens this season. And since that's a lot to take in, I wanted to take some time today to highlight just 5 lessons and focus in on a specific theme of the 5 core variables. These 5 core variables are light, temperature, space, soil, and water. When we optimize these variables for each crop, production is optimized as well. So if you're wondering why the corn behind me is so tall, yeah, it's because we optimized the 5 core variables. We'll come back to the subject of corn at the end of this video and cover what it takes to grow this crop successfully. First, let's look at a few cases where each of these 5 core variables came into play and discuss how it influenced production. My first lesson this year came at our home plot, and it was a reminder of the importance of irrigation. Some of you may remember the troubles we were having with our strawberries last year. It looked like a pest problem and I couldn't figure it out, so I sent in a sample of our strawberries to a research lab in our province. And they sent me back a report saying that the pests that were present were likely a sign of nutrient deficiency and possibly linked to poor irrigation. And I thought to myself, well, what? My irrigation is awesome. How could my irrigation be at fault? But after some time to think about that a little more, there seemed to be some pressure issues in my irrigation, in my drip lines, in my high tunnel. I thought the water with me wasn't coming out as fast as it should. I unscrewed the pipes at the end of my lines here, and there was always water coming out when I turned the timer on, but still, this report said I wasn't irrigating enough. So I really wanted to get to the heart of that situation this spring when I was getting everything set up. So I came to my irrigation control center here, got my filter, took that apart, made sure it wasn't clogged or anything. I had a pressure regulator here, took that out, swapped it out with another one. It didn't seem to make a difference on the outcoming pressure, so the pressure regulator was all right. Timer seemed to be working. I was turning it on and off, and it turned the water on and off whenever I did that, so that seems like it was fine. But after I disconnected these outlets here, it turned out that the amount of water that it was letting through was at such a slow flow rate that it wasn't enough to irrigate at the proper rate. So at some point, I'm probably guilty of letting this timer sit out here in the frost, and I suppose that the inner mechanism got a little bit damaged when I allowed it to freeze a bit at some point in my gardening setup or cleanup. So as soon as I switched this out to a new timer, things were flowing perfectly again, and I could use the same timings that I had been using in the past, but now my vegetables were getting enough water, finally. So in hindsight, now I see that this problem of irrigation was influencing several problems in my plot last year. I had powdery mildew on my cucumbers and melons showing up in the high tunnel, which is unusual, but they weren't handling the heat stress very well last year. Powdery mildew showed up. I had worse performance on my pole beans, really unusual there because they're usually pretty vigorous plants. You'll see those later today. Trouble with pollination in the peppers in the high tunnel. Maybe that was connected to irrigation as well, but generally when we solve the root of the problem like this, we start to see other problems or other symptoms of problems start to disappear. So this year, the strawberries were much happier as a result, and I see all of my other crops are thriving to another level as well. So first lesson, fundamentals are always important. Water is one of the 5 core variables. We'll get to some other core variables later today, but we always got to make sure our plants are getting enough water. The next lesson relates to some sun exposure difference between the south side of our high tunnel, which we're on right now, and the north side. The last 2 years we had plum regal tomatoes here. They yielded around 240 pounds per bed. Each of those years, really consistent performance. So I thought, okay, we've got a consistent performer here. What would happen if we took that crop away from its full sun exposure over here and put it over to the north side? So let's have a look at those. Here's the same crop of plum regal tomatoes that we've been growing for sauce over the last several years now. The spacing's identical, the method of support is identical, still Florida weave. There are still a ton of fruit here, but since we've been measuring, I also know that at this point last year, we had already harvested 140 pounds from this bed. And this year we've only harvested 103 pounds from this bed. So we're behind in overall yield so far, confirming just that the move to the north side of the greenhouse is detrimental to the performance, as we should expect. But still remarkable, I think, that this crop can pump out well over 100 pounds of tomatoes in a slightly shady zone of our high tunnel. Some of the heirloom tomatoes that we've got further down there are much less impressive in terms of the yield per square foot. We won't head down there today because those are the main lessons I wanted to cover here, but before we leave, you should check out some of these melons. They are alive and well, and this year, no powdery mildew because we fine-tuned our irrigation troubles from last year. Our other lessons from this plot came from our field beds, so let's head outside here. One of the relay planting experiments I've been wanting to try is combining really early snap peas with pole beans. Because I thought these crops have a couple things in common. One is they don't take the entire growing season. I have to plant my beans a little later after the soil is warmed up so they're most comfortable. So we miss out on that really early spring portion. Snap peas, on the other hand, like a really early start so they can get comfortable growing before things get hot. So I thought, what if we could stretch the limits of these two crops and get early snap peas followed by pole beans, and then even use the same trellis in the same bed. Now at first it doesn't seem like this is a lesson related to any of the 5 core variables, but it's actually really related to temperature. One of the main ways that we influence the temperature that our crops experience is by the time that we choose to plant them. Peas prefer to grow when the temperatures are relatively cool for our growing season. So we know that we can push them to the extreme limits of our early spring planting dates. And beans, on the other hand, prefer to grow in our warmest period of the year. So we know that they thrive if we delay their planting later into the spring or even summer. So what does it look like to pull off a potential pea to bean relay planting in our short growing season? Well, we started with early snap peas that I transplanted out here in April. That allowed them to be maturing at the end of June. From June 30th to July 15th, we harvested all the snap peas from this bed, and that freed up the space from July 15th onward to plant beans. The problem is, I know from experience, if I push my bean planting into July, there's not enough time to get mature beans. So instead of waiting for my peas to finish entirely on July 15th, I got a head start with my beans by planting them at the base here on June 28th. So we actually hadn't even started to harvest our first peas yet, but I knew because they were flowering that they were about to yield their crop, and I also knew that the harvest window for peas is 10 to 14 days. And I know that if I start bean transplants, it takes 10 to 14 days to get them at a stage to transplant. So I thought if I seed them here outside the rows of my peas, they can grow in part shade for the first couple weeks just to get germinated and started. And then once I take the peas out from the middle here, the beans will have full light exposure and they'll be able to take off. But that was all theory. I had to try it out, and I'm happy to say that things worked out very nicely. I've tried many relay plantings in the past that haven't worked out so desirably. So this is one success I'm pleased to pass on to you. That 2-week overlap that I gave these crops when the beans and the peas were in the same bed at the same time made this relay planting much more productive. We had 8 pounds of snap peas come out of this 5-foot long bed for the first crop, and then since then we've harvested already 22 pounds of beans. One question I had remaining is, will these beans catch up to the normal yield that we'd expect a full crop of beans to have? That total would be 28 pounds. That's what we've got from the past from one of these 5-foot beds for the full season. We do have still beans to harvest here, not much flowering though. Do we have baby beans? We've got we've had some cool nights, so maybe they are shutting down. I don't see any flowering, and that's always an indication of what harvest is to come. So I'm going to guess that we're going to be shutting down here with maybe 1 or 2 more harvests. And so I don't think we'll creep up to the 28 pounds total that we would expect if we had just beans in this bed for the entire season. But the fact that we took advantage of this space that would have otherwise been empty if we didn't plant a secondary crop, I think is a big win. So I'm going to continue to perfect this timing with these 2 crops, and yeah, I'm happy with that planting overall. Things are starting to empty out here at our Avenue H plot. We had 3 beds of onions that are now curing. Our no-dig potatoes were in the far bed here. But there are still several lessons I want to point out for you here in mid-September. We've got some fall carrots here. This is our first lesson. And what I wanted to point out was that our fall carrots have a significantly different spacing than the carrot bed inside the fence here. And this spacing difference wasn't my intention, but because it happened, we can look at the results here as a reminder of how important spacing is for not just carrots, but all crops. What happened here was when I seed carrots, I use my earthway seeder, and that's really convenient, but sometimes when the soil is too wet, the soil from the bed will stick to the wheels of the seeder, and that's what happened in this case. And I ended up seeding the entire bed without really noticing that the soil was clinging to the rear wheel of my seeder. So when I got done seeding the bed, I thought, well, did the seeds actually go into the soil, or did they end up clinging to the wheel in the back of the seeder and just get spread out everywhere? Are they just all stuck to the wheel? And carrot seeds are so small, I wasn't really sure. So I ended up cleaning off the wheels and reseeding the entire bed, knowing that I was probably adding a bunch of extra seed and thinking that I would come back in a few weeks and thin the bed to the desired density. The unfortunate part of the story is that I didn't end up coming back to thin carrots because our summer got busy with the move and I don't really like thinning carrots. So I put it off. And now I'm faced with a bed of carrots that's almost twice the density that I would prefer. Let's look at the consequences here. Let's just dig up a few of these carrots. They've been in here for 90 days, so we should be looking at pretty full-size carrots. And for the 8-row spacing that we're using now in our 30-inch wide bed, I would want in-row spacing of 2.5 inches. And I can get that using our plant spacing calculator. Look at how dense we are here. So is there a carrot every 2.5 inches in our row? Here's a gap, but here, 1, 2, 3, one, that's like 1 inch spacing, even less than 1 inch. 1 inch spacing on this side. This is a nice string here, but it's still like much less than 1.5 inches. This spacing would be acceptable if we didn't have a row right beside it, and a row right beside it here, and then another row. Like we've got 8 rows here. And we do that to get the most even carrot spacing possible, but when we end up seeding too many carrots in each row, then we end up with this jungle. The tops get really stringy, and each plant can't mature to its natural ability. So I'm going to predict, I haven't dug any of these carrots yet. Some people have been trying, but I haven't dug into this yet, but I'm going to predict we're going to get some stubby carrots as a result of this high density. Let's just grab some from the middle here carefully. Okay, we've got those. These are Mokum carrots, which I favor for growing in boulevards because you can't pull them out by their tops. They're really hard to steal. So the person or people that have been trying to steal these have been thoroughly frustrated by the fact that they just pull the tops and then they rip off. Okay, so I'm not as disappointed as I have been in some years when I've had really high density carrots. This is going to be acceptable. But if we come down here and look at these more closely, after 90 days, we shouldn't be seeing anything like this. Like these are all, let's leave that. Let's ignore this one as an outlier, but these regular guys, they should all be full length of carrot like this, and much thicker, like at least thicker than my thumb, like an inch thicker. These are going to be great eating quality, but when I have a bed of carrots that are all this size, it takes me a lot more labor for the amount of yield that I'm getting. If I have carrots that are all full size, like 6 to 8 inches in length, and they're filled out right to the tip, then I'm looking at a carrot that's about 80 to 100 grams each. It's still fresh and sweet and high quality, and it's crisp. And it takes a lot less labor for me to harvest all of that food from my bed. The larger carrots also store a lot better than these little skinny guys. So this isn't the full story though. Let's go check that other bed inside the fence and see how they compare to these. We'll take these with us so we can have a look. Okay, so our high density carrots are there. Let's pull out some of these standard density carrots. Let's see how they look. This is a different variety, so there's that variable. These are rainbow carrots. Oh, and before we do this, we should confirm that this spacing is actually different. So come in and look. Actually, that's a little tight patch there where we've got a carrot almost every 1.5 inches. We've got a gap. Let's look a little further down the row. That's like every 1.5 inches, 2 gaps. This spacing isn't all that different from the ones out there. They are. It's a little more sparse on the inside here. I'll pull some from the middle of the bed here again as well. Okay, there's our difference. Side by side, you can see the diameter of these carrots. Like, this is one of the longer ones. This is a longer one over here, really skinny on the right. A medium-sized carrot, even just difference in girth there. And that's not just the difference in variety. I've grown these varieties both many times. And these Mokum carrots do size up the same way as these if they just have more space. So if we're always harvesting these little carrots with every handful, it takes a lot more handfuls to add up to the same amount of mass as a carrot that's grown with more space. So it's not as much of a difference there as I anticipated, but I still wanted to take the opportunity to point that out. A lot of people ask questions about why their carrots are short and stubby, and spacing is one of the major factors that influences that. That's why spacing is one of the 5 core variables that I continue to stress repeatedly. And another one of those variables that's come into play here at this plot this year is soil quality. So let's take a minute to show the extreme impact of poor soil on a crop. This site has a history of construction because there was a new house built just before we started using this plot. There's a lot of heavy machinery here, a lot of compacted gravel right close to the house. And this first bed was extremely difficult to dig into. And over the years, I've had varying success growing things in these first 2 beds. Generally, the crops that did the best were ones that had shallow root systems. Like last year, I had a great crop of onions here. They generally have a pretty shallow root, so they could thrive off the compost that I added to the top. But this year, I had strawberries here in the spring that I ended up pulling out to put squash here. And in that transition, I didn't add any compost, so I skipped the compost. And the bed compaction is still an issue here. So we ended up seeing an extreme difference between the squash that we grew in this bed and the squash that we grew even in the one bed over is significantly different. And then the squash back there behind the corn grew as we would normally expect. Big, lush leaves spreading abundantly across multiple beds beside them. These ones kind of stuck to their bed, and this is pathetic. And the yields corresponded. This first bed of Little Gem curry squash yielded only 15 pounds. The next bed of Delicata squash yielded 34 pounds. The far 2 beds, under normal circumstances, yielded 64 pounds for our Prism butternut squash, and our Sweet Mama squash yielded 70 pounds. That's more in the realm that I would expect. 15 pounds for an entire bed is what we got here. So what variables are different? The plant spacing is the same. The light's the same. Got pretty full sun exposure in each case. Irrigation's exactly the same. The only thing left to examine is the soil. So I'm just curious to see what's going on under here. Is there still compacted gravel under there? It's kind of sandy. You can see, if you come closer here, you can see a bit of a soil profile. It's dark at the top here, and then just gets to this really smooth, sandy stuff, but it doesn't look terribly bad. But it is incredibly hard. You can probably hear that even on the camera. Let's compare this to what's going on in the other beds in the background. This area has a history of being a garden for many years. I'm expecting that we should be able to get deeper here without much trouble, but I honestly haven't tried this since I originally started to loosen up these beds. Will I find a bottom here like I did in the other zone? So far, my shovel's just driving down deeper. Every time I throw it in, it goes deeper, which is satisfying. And we also don't see like the stop of this. There's not a definitive line in the soil here. There's not like a black zone on the top and then a switch to a brown zone down below, where in the other case there was a lot less organic matter. It just seems to be a lot more consistent right down to the lower depths. And like I said a moment ago, the shovel just keeps going deeper. So there's our soil level there. No problem getting our shovel down 18 inches deep, whereas the other one I just hit a wall. So that's the variable that I'm going to attribute the difference in production here for our winter squash this year. Can't cut corners with soil. So there were a few examples showing how the 5 core variables are constantly influencing production in our homestead garden. I wanted to finish this video today coming back to the subject of corn, because I know corn is a crop that so many new growers struggle with. And again, the challenge of growing corn relates to the 5 core variables. Can you get them right? Let's see. I'm standing in front of a bed of sweet corn today that's fully mature and ready for harvest. It's taken absolutely no maintenance on my part to grow, so as an outsider, it looks incredibly easy and foolproof, but I've been successful only because of the details. Let's start with the soil. Before planting any of this corn, I prepared the bed by loosening the soil with a broad fork and then topping the surface with a layer of compost. The broad forking removed any potential compaction and ensured that there was an ample supply of oxygen for the microbes below, and the topping of compost serves as a rich supply of nutrients and organic matter to feed the microbe population as well, which in turn will give the corn the nutrients that it requires. But none of that works if we don't supply enough water. So to make sure that the corn has a sufficient amount of moisture in the soil below it, I've installed 2 parallel drip lines, like what we see in the bed beside us here, underneath the landscape fabric. So between every row of corn that we've got in this bed is a drip line that has been serving this corn with up to 2 inches of water per week in the height of summer. Without water, nutrients simply can't flow from the roots to the leaves, and with too much water, the roots are starved of oxygen and start to rot in place. So we really need to get the amount of water right. But that water doesn't matter very much unless we put our corn in a situation where it's got full access to light. So it's also very important that we've chosen a location for corn where there are no obstructions from trees or buildings, so we get an ample amount of light to drive photosynthesis in this crop. But the water, soil, and light still don't matter at all if we don't get the spacing right. So it's also really important that we've only got 60 plants of corn in this 50 square foot bed. That's given each plant space to grow to maturity. It's full enough that we're not wasting space, but still not too dense that these corn plants are competing too much with each other and not having enough room to actually grow. And now that we've made it to that last week of September and I've controlled all 5 variables along the way, I get to experience the rewards. And the rewards are that I've got a fully mature bed of corn in front of me. Everything's ready for harvest at the same time. All the plants are yielding a nice ear of corn. And if I take one off, I could do a quick check to make sure that it's mature. I've been watching the silk here to see that it's drying up, and that's the first sign of maturity, but I also want to do a quick check by pulling down the husk a little bit here and poking the top few kernels with my thumb. If I see a white milky substance emerge from these kernels, that's a sign that we're ready to harvest. If that substance is still clear, then they need a bit more time yet. So let's give this a quick check. I think we should be good though. There we go. Yeah, so that substance is definitely milky, not clear anymore. Even that's sweet. Oh, can't wait to get this in the oven. So I'm going to harvest this quickly before we wrap up. So there you have it. I know I've stressed the importance of the 5 core variables repeatedly in this one, but it's so important, so I hope it's sinking in. I focus on the 5 core variables as one of the major breakthroughs that I share in my free workshop. In that workshop, I also introduce you to the method we use to master planning and the keys to making everything easy. So if you're serious about growing a ton of food for your family and doing it well, head over to the workshop, and since it's interactive, don't be afraid to ask questions along the way. I'll leave a link for you in the description. See you in the next one.